You would become storytellers yourself. You would be working as, in content marketing. You would be working in, you'd be working with brands. You would be working in tourism boards. You would be you would set up your own travel company, or you could have your own blog, or you could have your own, content platforms, videos. And I think the most important thing that we all need is storytelling, because storytelling is the most universal thing. And so the buzzwords that are going around today, which is either content writing or travel writing or blogging or content marketing, as they say, all this actually, there's one word which kind of puts everything together. I would say that that is storytelling. Because storytelling is, we've all as kids heard stories. We've heard stories from our family. We've heard stories from our parents. We've read stories in our school books. We've read stories in Amachitrakatas, in our epics. We've grown up in fairy tales. We've grown up with stories. And today's stories are being used very effectively by brands to tell their story, to connect to their audience, to create campaigns, to do content marketing, to do content writing, to do travel writing. So I thought that instead of talking about blogging and travel writing, which I'm happy to answer questions about later, I would like to delve a little bit about storytelling. And I would like to talk to you about some examples of various brands, because I believe that, going forward, that you would all become, part of the industry yourself. You might be working with a hotel, or you'd be working with an airline partner, or you would be working with an airlines, or you'd be working with the tourism board. And you need these stories to communicate. I mean, you would need to know how to tell stories to communicate the story of your brand or the destination or your property, or even as a tour operator, if you want to kind of, sell your services. So keeping this in mind, I'm going to start with a little story. If you can Google this later. So we are going to go to the land of the Land Rover. All of us have heard of the brand, the Land Rover, the car, the vehicle. And the interesting thing is that when the Land Rover wanted to celebrate their 70 years, they decided to, that all of them came together and they were trying to brainstorm and figure out what kind of content to kind of put together. And that's when they decided that they would go and celebrate the land of the Land Rover. So they went, the crew of about 10 people, they went to this very little village called Manibanjang, which is, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it is somewhere, it's a very, very remote village in the Himalayas in West Bengal. And it is close to the Indo-Nepal border. And in this particular village, the whole story of Land Rover began about 70 odd years ago. It was told that when these people were living in these villages, they were living in extremely remote areas, and they would not even get any supplies. And they had to depend on ponies, for instance, to get even basic supplies for themselves. And the team went and then after that, the Land Rover, the first of the many Land Rover series, was launched. And these drivers used to go on these really treacherous roads, and they used to ferry and bring supplies and provisions and what essentials and whatever that is required for this village. And that's how the whole story began. And why am I starting with this story? I mean, it's because this story is, for me, is a very epitome of storytelling. I wish I could show you the video, but you can go and check there, because here was a brand trying to tell its story, going back to its roots, it could have just shown a great feature of the latest car. It could have shown its, the special features. It could have done a very glamorous shoot in the mountains. But instead, it decided to go back and spend time talking to drivers, talking to families, talking to people, showing you the place where the origin of this brand began. And that to me is a real story. That to me is a story that goes to the roots, the story of a land, and the brand, it's connecting itself to the word land, the Land Rover and its land. It's connecting to the people, it's connecting to the audience. And if you actually see, that is an epitome of a good storytelling, because good stories are real. Good stories are about us. Good stories are going back in the roots. Good stories are about people. And these are the kind of stories that today people remember after so many years. So as most of you, like I said, would obviously go into brands, and you would become a brand manager or a content manager, or you might want to create campaigns, or you would want to do content marketing. And for such purposes, if you actually see, your story actually starts with a brand. And in this case, if you're a travel writer or a travel blogger like we are, then we are the brand ourselves. And we have to tell our stories in the most compelling way possible. So it is very, very important that storytelling becomes the most important aspect of any communication that we kind of talk. And why is a story so important? Because if when you're telling the brand story, what does the brand want to do? The brand wants to reach out to its audience. And what is an audience looking for? The audience is looking for a story that that kind of connects or resonates with the brand. So in such cases, there are stories which the stories are like a bridge between the brand and its audience. So I gave you the example of a Land Rover, but I'm going to tell you some more examples of various brands that have done this so successfully. For example, Expedia did an entire series where they actually asked audience to go, they asked their audience to go and find your story. They asked people to go out into the world and create stories and come back and tell them about their stories. And people shared all kinds of stories. It could be travel story, it could be personal story, it could be a moment of euphoria. And all these together were then put together into a lovely little TVC, and they branded it like their own brand story with voices of various people in the audience. So that is another compelling way of telling stories. Another third way of telling stories, and this is a very small little, I don't know whether you've heard of a little company called Rip Curls, and they are actually a small company that is actually into adventure sports and primarily into surfing. And they realized that a lot of their audience was actually going on the net and looking for tips and recommendations on the best waves. I'm talking about surfing, right? So they were looking for the best waves that they could find. They were looking for places where they could, which was a good place to go for surfing, what is the weather condition. They wanted experiences to be shared. So the brand said that, why should I let my audience look for it elsewhere? Instead, I will kind of form a community myself. And they created this community called The Search. And it's like a little app where the surfer community themselves came and started recommending the best places they have surfed, the weather conditions, the waves, and various other things related to surfing. So if you see all these three, each of these clients have reached, each of these brands have said different forms of storytelling, but they have all had one main thing, which is they have reached out to their audience with their various stories. So some have asked, Land Rover has told its story, connected to its brand story, and gone back to its roots, and it's talking about its own history, and it's talking about the people. Expedia, on the contrary, was actually reaching out to the people out there and telling them to share their story. Whereas Rip Curls decided to create a community by itself by telling stories of their surfing experience. So which brings me back to this whole point about how stories are so essential if you're planning to bridge the gap between you as a brand and your audience. And so, like I said before, I have divided this talk into two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk to you and give you some examples like this of brands that have looked at storytelling, of brands that have created campaigns out of storytelling, and brands that have put together very effective storytelling opportunities for people to participate in. The second part of it, I'm going to talk a little bit about, how to create good stories, pointers to create good stories, and whether you're a blog or whether you're a brand, or whether you're a storyteller, or whether you're a travel writer or a blogger, where do you look for stories? What kind of stories you want to put together? And I will probably give you some more of my own experience. Let me know if this is something you want, or if there's something else you have in mind. Please feel free to be interactive, because it's very difficult to speak to a blank screen out here. I wish I had faces to talk to, or, I'm just seeing little images, and it's just rest of it is just a blank screen. So I would really appreciate if there's some kind of a communication from you guys, some kind of an interactive possibilities, because this is a new experience of just talking to a blank screen for about an hour. So yeah, so coming back to the talk itself, so I was telling you about how stories form the crux of any communication. And if you go back to Ibn Battuta, the famous explorer, the Moroccan explorer, who is most of you have heard of him, I hope. And he is the master storyteller himself, and his journals have recorded so much. He's a historian, he's a scholar, he's traveled the world, and for a lot of travelers like us, he's an inspiration, and he's journaled a lot. And he rightfully says that travel, it makes you speechless, but then it makes you into a storyteller. And that's what we travelers do. In every form, we tell stories. We tell stories in our Instagram. We tell stories in our blogs. We tell stories in our articles. We tell stories in our Facebook updates. We tell stories in our videos. We tell stories in our IGTV. I mean, everything that we say is a story. And it's all about how do you tell that story, and what are the nuances of the story that makes it much more interesting. And if you're a brand, if you're consciously positioning yourself as a brand, whether you as a brand, or whether you're working for a brand and that wants to position itself, stories are extremely powerful in kind of communicating. Stories are extremely powerful in kind of communicating the brand and its needs. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, when I started becoming, I didn't know that when I was a blogger that there was some possibilities of being an influencer. I had no clue what influencing means at that time, because we were just bloggers, and we used to just write a lot of stories, and we used to just share a lot of content on our various platforms. So the thing is, we were with Marriott. Marriott came back to us and said that they wanted to create an entire campaign called Travel Brilliantly. Now, Travel Brilliantly is like a little campaign, which Travel Brilliantly is like a motherhood statement, right? We all want to travel brilliantly, but how do you kind of showcase travel brilliantly as a concept in the form of a video to your audience? So what they did is they called influencers like us to do videos of what travel brilliantly means for us. So I did a video in Marriott talking about what it means for me. What are the pillars I'm looking for when I travel? What are the pillars of design? What's the pillars of experience? What is the pillars of my travel brilliantly as a concept meant to me? And then I asked audiences to kind of come back with their experiences of what travel brilliantly meant for them. So in this context, we were able to tell the concept of travel brilliantly in the form of a short narrative. And that is what storytelling is. So somebody has asked me a question saying, what is the difference between storytelling and blogging? And I'll come to that question in detail later when I'm talking about blogging. But primarily, I want you to understand one thing, that storytelling pervades, or rather is the basic foundation of any content that you put out there. Whether you want to create a campaign, whether you want to create write an experience of a place, whether you're talking about your own personal vacation that you went to, whether you're writing about a particular person that you met during your travel, whether you're writing about an IGTV video, whether you're shooting an IGTV video, whether you're putting a tweet out there, stories are like the basic framework. So here I'm going to give you examples of how different people look at stories in the form of campaigns, in the form of content, in the form of ideas, in the form of various things that I have done as an influencer. And I will come back to some of these questions later. So let me just finish with one part of the talk so that you please keep the questions coming. Let me just finish one part of the talk, and then I'll probably answer a few questions, and then I'll go back to the second part. I think that works for everybody, I hope. Yeah. So coming back, I was talking about how stories bridge the gap between the audience and the brand and the audience, right? So I was telling you about Marriott's concept, and I spoke to you about Land Rover, for instance, and I spoke to you about Expedia, and I spoke to you about Rip Curls. And I want to talk to you about Lufthansa. I mean, I'm sure everybody out here has seen the Lufthansa campaigns, which is more Indian than you think, or Say Yes to the World. To me, they are brilliant stories. I mean, they took a very simple concept where people had this mindset of Lufthansa being a very German brand, and they kind of created little TVCs and concepts around it to say that this is more Indian than you think. Same with Say Yes to the World, trying to tell people that, you know, travel has no barriers, travel has no, you should be open to all cultures, and you're open to all experiences. You go with an open mind. And the best thing about Say Yes to the World was like an open-ended thing. I mean, everybody interpreted the story in their own way. Another brilliant brand. Can you think of more brands that are doing good stories? Can anybody suggest brands? I mean, since we're talking about brands and storytelling, can you suggest good brands in the travel space that have said good stories? For me, I think Airbnb is one great brand. I mean, if you look at each campaign of Airbnb, they tell a story. Whether it is about that's why we Airbnb, whether it is about belong anywhere. You know, if you look at each of their stories, whether it's a video, whether it's a blog, whether it is their digital content, whether everything focuses on one thing. Can someone tell me what Airbnb focuses on? Can anybody guess what Airbnb simply focuses on? It's just one simple thing that they focus on usually on their stories. No, it's not comfort. Home away from home. Yes, somebody's got it. Yeah. So yes, it's experiences and authentic experiences, but it is also local experiences. That's the most important thing that they talk about, which is local experience. Yeah, you got that right, Nidhi. So the thing is, I was watching a video and they were talking about don't go to Paris, don't travel to Paris. And they say, but live in Paris. And why do they say live in Paris? Because they're saying live like a local in Paris. They're saying experience Paris like a local, stay in a local home, go to the places where the locals go. Don't go like a tourist, don't go like a traveler. Go as how a local look at it. Look at the destination, look at your experience like a local. So they're obviously their homes are, what are their products? Their products are the homes of the local people. But they're not going to say, okay, look at our homes and we have these great homes. They do a campaign for that as well. But this particular campaign was positioning themselves as authentic local experiences that you can have. And that is the story that they wanted to communicate. So when you're talking about stories doesn't have to be once upon a time there was blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's a different way of looking at storytelling. But the story is also about picking a little concept, picking a little idea, picking a little thought, and weaving it into a little story of its own. And that is why I'm going to talk to you about some pointers that you need to keep in mind, irrespective of whether you're working for a brand or whether you're a brand yourself, on how to build these, how to come up with stories. So the first thing I've already told you is that the story has to be about the brand. And we spoke about Airbnb. I'll give you another lovely example about this. This is from my own personal experience again. I don't know how many of you have heard of Citadines. Show of hands. Any of you have heard of Citadines? Okay, so Citadines is actually a French apart hotel. It's based out of France, and now they are all over they're all over the world mostly. And they started in France, and they've been around for more than about 30-40 years now. So when they were celebrating their 30th anniversary in Europe, they wanted a very interesting campaign to celebrate their thing. So what they did is they called 4 bloggers from around the world. So I went from India, and then there was somebody from UK, there was someone from Germany, and there was another person from France. All 4 of us were asked to choose any 3 destinations of our choice where Citadines had a presence in Europe. And the thing is, there's no site, nobody is going to handhold us and take us sightseeing. We had to create our own itineraries. We had to create our own experiences. We could do anything we want. We spent 3 days in each city. And every day we had to come up with our own experiences of the city and our stories around our life. And Syngeteens, because it's an apart hotel. What I mean by an apart hotel is because it's an apartment come a hotel together. A lot of it is about do-it-yourself concept, and it's also like a local experiences. So you kind of live in your own studio apartment, you cook your own food, you go local sightseeing everywhere. Most of them are in the city center or close to the city center, and there are good metro stations around. So you explore it the way a local would explore it. And we are also talking about staying for a longer time. But it was also about not the brand so much, but about the destination, but through the eyes of the brand. And for me, this was an amazing experience because this was early days of blogging, and this was early days of, and so somebody asked me, what is the difference between storytelling and blogging? Personally, for me, there is no difference between storytelling and blogging. They are the same. Because here I was sharing my experiences in the form of various stories. So I would like suddenly get onto a bus and go to I was in Cannes, and I just suddenly heard that there is this lovely little weekend get place, which is the small little town here, which was a land of perfumes, and it was just a bus ride away. And I would just get onto the bus and just go and discover this little town and go and see a perfume museum and spend time, into a perfume factory. And they used to do handmade perfumes. And I'd come back and write the story. Similarly, I went to another island. I just took a ferry and I crossed over and went to an island. And there I found out that there was this. There's a I don't know if you guys have heard about this movie or a book called The Man in the Iron Mask. It's a legend, and they say that there's this island is actually there's no one living there. It's actually it's an isolated island. But apparently in early days there used to be a prison there, and in that prison there's a particular room where the man in the Iron Mask was supposed to have been held as captive. So these are little stories for me. And I think every day we used to come up with these little stories and our little discoveries, as we called it. And we used to create a lot of stories. Yes, I used to do the listicles and I used to do the 10 things to do. So in Brussels, I went to the comic museum, and we went and looked at the Tintin museum. And then in Berlin, we went and did the street art tour. So every place we created unique or different content based on our interest, but each one is a story. Each one is an experience, and each one tells a very different way of exploring that particular destination. So for me, a story has to have, it's about the brand, but it is also about me. It's also about how I am experiencing that particular destination. It's also about how I am seeing the whole thing. And it is also about bringing in a human angle to the whole thing. It's also about bringing in a human interface to the content. So it's not like, okay, I just went here, I saw this, I had a cup of tea, and this cheesecake here is fantastic. Yeah, all that is great. But I would like to know what it took to make the cheesecake. I would like to know if there's a backstory behind the cheesecake. I would like to know if there is something about this cup. Is there something traditional here that I could like to write about? So when you're selling a destination, or when you're selling an idea, or when you're selling a concept, or when you're selling yourself as a travel writer, you tell stories, and that's what matters. And the idea is, how do we look for these stories? And that's what I'm going to come to at a later point of time. So some of the tips that so far, are we good? Any can I get some yay, nay? Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, so like I said, thank you so much. Thank you. So we'll continue. So I'm giving you more tips. I'm going to just do a little recap. I hope I'm not rambling. So we're going to go into, we were talking about tips, and we were talking about pointers for good stories. And I said the first thing was that it has to be about the brand. And I also said that it is very important that when you tell these stories about the brand, and you also have to bring in a bit of you into it. Can anybody guess what the second point would be? I mean, any ideas? What should be the second most important thing when you're telling a story, or when you're looking for a pointer for the story? Anybody? Just come on, just guess. All you have to do is to type something. I'm the one who's talking here. Yeah, a lot of people are saying interesting things. Can someone said about connecting? Can you elaborate on that? connecting people. Yeah, I'll come to the questions later. So, like I said, yeah, so someone said it's about connecting people. And I think that's very, very important, because if you notice, and thank you, that means you're all listening to what I was talking. So when I mentioned that the important things, the two important things about storytelling is that one is the brand and the other one is the audience. And I also mentioned that it is all about bringing these two together, that stories actually bridge. So even as a travel blogger, I need to connect to my audience. As a person who's talking here, I need to connect to you, because if I'm going to be rambling and speaking to myself, it's like talking to the sky. I'm not talking to you guys, right? So it's very important that we bring in that connect. The story has to be in sync between me, the brand, and the audience. And how do you do that? And some examples of some very good interactive content that I want to talk to you about, which brands have done first, is if you look at Interpret. I mean, everybody's heard of Interpret Travel, right? I mean, Interpret Travel it focuses on a lot of adventures. It focuses on a lot of content which is relevant to a small group, but they do a lot of these long series thing, offbeat content, adventure content. So just like Rip Curls, they realized that they needed to kind of bring the community together, and they decided to do a series. They decided to do a travel journal, and you can go check this out, because this travel journal has some really amazing experiences by travelers who've been on Interpret tours, and they have created this kind of a content. So the whole idea is that here they have used stories and content to build a community. And that is very, very important if you are looking at yourself. If tomorrow you go and you build yourself into, you work for a particular travel brand or a tourism board or airlines or hotels, and you are looking at content marketing or content writing, and you're looking at some kind of a work to put together to create a community which is very unique to you. So when I started out, after I quit my career about 15 years ago in media, I had about 15 years experience in media. I used to be in radio and television before this. And when I quit my job and I started blogging, the first thing I did is in 2007, this is okay, I worked with Club Mahindra. And Club Mahindra had, at that time, a great idea called Clay. And that was called Club Mahindra and You. And the whole idea was, at that time, blogging had not really taken off. I'm talking about 2007. We were just very, very new. And there were a bunch of people who used to write and share stories. And we used to just, it was to be more of a hobby for a lot of us. And we used to travel and come back and write our experiences and tips and recommendations and storytelling. And we said that, so Club Mahindra asked me to kind of be like a community manager and edit this entire portal and get the community to share their writings on this, including I write and also get other people to write also. And we also did a lot of community outreach programs. So what we did here is that we took bloggers. At that time, they was, like I said, we're not the way today a lot of people go everywhere. But at that time, it was not too many opportunities available. People used to spend their own money to travel. And so they took people to their various Club Mahindra properties to experience the destination. So, and the idea was that you don't really do a review of the hotel. I mean, if you want to, that's okay. But the whole idea was to talk about the experiences that the destination offered and the stories that one could generate around the place through the brand. So that was a very subtle way of bringing the brand story inside. Some brands like to tell their story up front. Some brands like to tell their stories in a very subtle way. So if you are writing content today for yourself or for your brand or for your client or for your or for a tourism board, you need to figure out what kind of content you want to put out there. You want to put content. Okay, do you want to put content which is that someone telling me that they don't want to hear me? So,
please switch off your mics.
It's okay. It's nice to hear some distraction once in a while. It's better than hearing my own voice all the time. Yeah. So I was coming back to how it's very important that you figure out whether to tell your story in a bold, direct way or whether to tell your story in a lot more subtle, but use the community or use your audience to tell your story. I'm coming back to point number 3, and this was again spoken about in the previous, one of you had guessed it, which is that you need to bring in the personal element out there. You have to bring in the human element out there, because stories are not fun otherwise. Stories are fun only when you talk about people. Stories are fun only when you bring in human element. Stories are fun only when you bring in emotions into it. So there's humor, there's quirkiness, there is, and I'll tell you a lot of fun stories that I have had when I'm traveling, but I will stick to brands for now, okay? So Marriott, I was telling you, has this other very interesting video that they've created called Two Bellmen, okay? And this is a great content exercise where they have actually got two bellmen of their hotel telling stories and having a little chat and having, and it's a very fun thing that they have done. And I think it's a great idea because, you can tell stories through different places. I can actually do a narrative. I can take a video and I can just shoot around the place and I can say, guys, I'm having this brilliant breakfast here and this is a great place to rest. We have a fancy swimming pool. But just imagine telling the story through the eyes of two bellmen. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, that's something really funny and unique in its own way. Again, coming back to the Land of the Land Rover, which is a very emotional, here in this case, it's a very emotional, very story of resilience, story which kind of draws in a lot of sentiment. It goes back to your roots. So story has to have a personal and an emotional element, because otherwise it's not going to appeal to people. I mean, you watch certain good movies, you remember them because they carry a lot of emotion in them. They're either hard hitting or they're sentimental or they're romantic or they're funny. Without an emotion and without a human and a personal element, your stories are not going to be anywhere interesting. And travel stories also are like that. I mean, everybody travels, everybody goes and has chai in some place, everybody goes to some fancy restaurant, everybody goes to a luxurious swimming pool. What's the big deal? Why is your story different from another person's story? What is the personal element that you're bringing into the story? What is the observation that you're carrying into your story? So that brings me to the most important point, that the story has to be authentic. And somebody mentioned this, and thank you so much for saying that your story has to be extremely authentic. It's you. It's your experience. Thousands of people can go to Bali, but what makes it different from your experience is that it is extremely authentic and it is your experience. And it is what you saw, what you felt, what you experienced, and what you felt was different about the place, or nice about the place, or not so nice about the place. It's your observations. And that is very, very important. And I'm going to come back to that point a little later when I'm talking about good storytelling. And it is very important that you stick to authentic and not copy. So don't copy another person's style. Don't copy another person's content. Even if you're going to Wikipedia and you're going to copy the content, say it in your own words. Write it in your own style. Or attribute it to them. Say that I went here and I experienced this, and I was researching about it, and this is what Wikipedia also says. But ensure that credibility is not compromised ever when you tell your story, whether it's your story or whether it's your brand story, whether you're doing a travel writing activity or whether you're writing it for your brand. It's extremely, extremely important that the authenticity is not compromised. And then, of course, finally, the presentation matters. How you package your story, how you tell your story, what formats you use, whether you're doing it on certain stories are great on videos, certain stories are great on writing, certain stories are great with photographs, certain stories are looking good on Twitter. I don't want to write huge blogs. I'd rather say something very short on Instagram. So it depends on how you want to tell your story, and that's as well very important. So we are almost at the end of part 1, and I'm going to take a few questions, but I'm just going to sum up a little bit before that. So we have spoken about how stories are so important, and I told you that whether you do content writing or whether you do content marketing, whether you're creating campaigns for your brand, whether you're looking at travel writing, stories kind of cuts across everything. It's universal in its appeal. And give you a few examples of brands that have used stories very well in their campaigns, be it Land Rover, Expedia, Marriott and Ripkels, Lufthansa, Airbnb. I've also spoken to you about, a few pointers in writing good stories, which is like the story has to be about the brand. You tell the brand story in its own unique voice. You're authentic about it. You kind of create an emotion angle there. You kind of ensure that you connect with your audience in your stories, and you bring in a most personal element out here. And some more examples. For example, Disneyland, Paris, they had a very, very cute story where they brought in a Donald Duck. They brought in a duckling which fell in love with Donald Duck. And they told the story through the eyes of the duckling. Again, a very unique way of presenting a story, because you could have typically gone and said, okay, this is what Disneyland has to offer, and this is where this ride does this, and this you can experience here, there. But here they said they wanted to tell the story through a duck, and a duck which loves Donald Duck. And there's a whole story around the Disney character out there, and they built a great brand. How many of you have heard of Queensland's tourism, which is about the best job in the world? Have you guys heard of it? So, even this was a campaign that happened 10 years ago. And how many of you actually applied or want to apply? So Queensland Tourism, for those who didn't know about this, thanks for answering some of you. Queensland Tourism had this great campaign that they did a few years ago, where they said they asked for people to apply for the best job in the world, which was to be a caretaker of the Great Barrier Reef. And till date, it remains the best story campaign of, even till date, people talk about this campaign because it's one of the best ways to tell a story about their brand. So all this is fine. We have talked about campaigns. We've talked about clients using campaigns, stories in their campaigns to position their brand, to reach out to audience, to tell a unique format, to bring in interactivity, to bring in credibility, to present a unique voice. But what about day-to-day content, right? I mean, all of you guys are thinking about that. I'm sure you are all saying, okay, fine, all these are campaigns and brands do it, but what about I have to write my own content, and I have to create my own story every day, and I have to create something on my blog, I have to do something on my thing. How do I do this? So I think for that, we are coming to part 2. And I would like to talk about, something that I started out on Instagram just a while ago, which is that I created this thing called the story of the day. I don't know how many of you follow me on Instagram. And I said that, most of the time when we travel, we look at certain experiences, like the most important experience, which is like, okay, I went here, I did this, I saw this, and I came back. But then I realized that there's a lot of backstories. There's a lot of story behind a story, okay, which is missed out. So it could be about a culture, it could be about a tradition, it could be a lost, forgotten tradition, it could be something quirky, it could be a belief, it could be a custom. And I said, why aren't we not writing about this? And I read about one of this in Vietnam, which kind of impressed me so much that I started this whole series based on it. So this Vietnam story was, I went to this little, I went to Hanoi, and in Hanoi, there's this extremely, very, very old temple of Confucius. I don't know how many of you have heard of it. It's actually one of the oldest universities. It's the first national university of Hanoi, of Vietnam, sorry. And it was a royal university. And it was also the temple of Confucius, because he was associated with learning and education. But this is where the royalty were first, it was their university initially before it became for the public. Now, amongst many things there, and each aspect of that university tells a tale, believe me. If you go there, you will be amazed by the dearth of stories. I mean, every wall has a story. You just have to be curious. But there was one very curious thing that I saw. I saw this very little girl, very cute girl. She was holding a piece of paper in her hand, and she was standing in front of this little place which had a lot of masks, and there was a lot of calligraphy around it. And her mother was taking a picture, and she was holding a little paper. So later, after I asked their permission whether I could take a picture or not, and then after I took the picture, I asked them about the whole story behind. I wanted to know what was the story behind it. And that's when she said that in the ancient days, what used to happen is that there were these masters who were also calligraphists, and most of the people were illiterate. They couldn't speak, they couldn't read. So what they and their students were learning here. So what these masters used to do is they used to believe in words that, like how we have affirmations today, like we wake up and say these affirmations. So they used to believe in these handwritten words, which were like affirmations for them. And these masters used to write on a piece of paper. So there used to be words like luck. There used to be words like success. And these words were handwritten by the masters and given to the family people, and they used to put them on their doors. And it used to be like a sign of good luck for them when they used to go to their exams. And this became a tradition with the Vietnamese New Year also, that people used to come to these masters and ask for similar words, and ask them to handwrite it and give it to them, so that it used to be like a New Year tradition. Now the thing is, if I had not asked for this story and if I had not been curious about it, I wouldn't have got the story at all. And I was very, very touched when I heard this story. And I was thinking during lockdown, for instance, what is that one word that we all would like to look at? I mean, to me, all of us would like to think of words that would mean a lot to us, right? And I think, yeah, hope, exactly. Hope. And I would probably look at health. And each of us would have a word that we would like to cling on to. And to me, this is a story. I mean, don't you all agree that this is a story by itself? And think for a while, and think for a minute that after this lockdown is over, just think of all the way people have told stories. Like this interaction between you and between me and all of you is a story by itself. I mean, who would have thought that there would be online lectures like this happening on a day-to-day basis? I mean, typically people would come and talk. Today, with the way the COVID has changed the way we are even consuming content, tourism boards are doing events out there. Australia has been doing 3-hour events. Maldives is planning events online. Very interesting. There are online wildlife safaris from South Africa to Tadoba. You can actually go online and actually see a live wildlife safari because you can't really travel out there. So the way the lockdown has changed the way people are even consuming content, that is a story by itself. And I'm sure going down the years, when we look back and when things hopefully come back to normal, we would look back and see how content had adapted, and how webinars, how incredible India has been doing series of webinars, how webinars have become almost like the new normal today in consuming news. So I personally think that the biggest thing that lockdown has taught us is resilience, is adaptability, is changing the way we consume news, is changing the way we consume changing the way we're going to be traveling. And probably this is going, once things come back to what they call new normal, there's going to be a lot of changes. And that is a story by itself. I mean, I don't know whether you see it that way, but I see it that way. And all this goes into a way that we perceive storytelling in a very different context. So anyway, I've actually kind of rambled here, and I'm going to take a few questions before I come back to the second part of it, which the second part I'm going to largely talk about how do we find stories. I'm going to talk about some examples of the stories that I have written and how I found them. I'm also going to talk about, some good pointers for good stories, what we need to look for when we are writing stories for travel writing. And those will be in part 2, but I think I shall take some questions now. Yeah, so someone has asked me, how can I manage budget to travel and shoot video as a college student? So budget is very, very, Aditya, thank you for asking that. Budget is very, I mean, right now, I think for a lot of us, budget is a very difficult point because of the lockdown. But I think going forward, it is very important that you plan well in advance. A lot of apps are free to edit and shoot. There are good mobile phones that are available. You can slowly plan your travel content. Like, for example, if I look at some of my videos the photos that I have shot, I didn't even have an aim and shoot camera about 10, 12, 15 years ago when I started blogging. And if everybody wanted to have the high-end equipment and then start creating content, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to keep in pace with whatever is the latest technology. So it's good to start somewhere and then keep kind of upgrading as we go by. There's a question which says, what is the best platform to present a story other than a blogging site? Well, I think that's we don't need to have any specific platforms. I think every platform has its unique way of presenting stories. Be it Instagram today is a great way of telling stories if you know how to tell stories, and not focus on only I, me, myself, but kind of create stories. Like I said, I've been trying to do my birding diaries. I try to diversify when I write my stories. There is also about videos are a great platform again. Live sessions are great platforms again. I think it's all about blogging is a brilliant platform in its own way, but it's also about how you want to tell stories in different formats and you can tweak around the same format. Janvi asked me, how do I find balance between documenting travel and enjoying? And that's a very, very, very difficult question, difficult thing, Janvi. Believe me, it's very, very difficult. And I've always find this. Sometimes I do a lot of travel and then I do a lot of writing and then I do a lot of writing and I do no travel. Well, that's something I think all of us have to find the balance based on what interests us. How can I write? Geetika says, how can I write effectively about a destination I've never visited? Well, honestly, you can't write at all about a destination that you've never visited it. Unless it's a research piece, unless it's a piece that you're writing as purely information based for a brochure or for a content material. In such cases, you have to look at good research material and write it. Personally, I don't write about places I have never visited. And if I have to write about something which is for an informative piece, then I would quote the sources where I'm writing it from. Shilpa asked me, how do I deal with sustainable and responsible traveling while writing stories? Shilpa, they're totally two unrelated questions. I'm not sure I get the right question, because stories are about all kinds of experiences. You can write sustainable and responsible travel stories, and you can write stories which are, which are pure touristy as well. If you're asking me how do I balance the two, well, I need to ensure that I keep my eyes and ears open for both kind of stories. So sometimes I'd like for example, I'm working on a series on my blog now, which is about people who are working in the sustainable and the responsible travel space and telling their stories. And I think that is a very interesting way of trying to create that whole angle of responsible and sustainable travel, especially since I can't travel myself now. How do I recognize my audience and promote the story successfully? Well, this is a topic by itself, and I think I will have to do a completely different session here. But this is where SEO helps to a large extent. This is where Google Analytics helps to a large extent. SEO to a large extent, your keyword search, for instance, is kind of gives you an indication into your audience minds. You know what your audience is looking for. And how do you promote the stories? And you need to know where your audience is. Like, for example, if I know what kind of audience comes to my Instagram page, I would tweak my content around it. I know if my blog audience is slightly different, I would write in a different style for them. So it's very important to know who your audience is. It's very important to know where they are and what their interests are, and then write around it. Rishabh asked me, do you think brand integration and tours organized by brand tourism board present seamless experiences, whereas reality can be mixed? See, there are both sides to every coin, because when you're traveling with the tourism board, you know that it is like a promo. You know that they are asking you to see what they want you to see. But if your eyes and ears, like someone said, right, travel is all about seeing things with a different lens. So you can still be authentic because it's your experience. They might want you to say something, but if you do not believe in it, I will not say it. And I will tell them that as well. Like, for example, I'll give you a classic example. In Mauritius, we went to this place, I think most of you are familiar with it, where you can touch a lion and pet a lion and all of that. Somehow it didn't feel right to me. At that point, I didn't want to insult the brand. So I said, I agreed to do the activity, but I told them that I will not promote it on social media and I will not talk about it on my blog, because I didn't feel right to do that. So that way you can make a choice and be authentic based on where you think what you want to portray and what you don't want to portray. And that is something which is very important, because you should never let credibility and integrity come in way of your of promotions with tourism brands. How can stories enthuse students of history? Oh, this is another very fascinating question, and I have written a lot about this in my blog as well. I think you need to romanticize history. I'm doing a fantastic course on Coursera on Roman art and archaeology, and it's just brilliant storytelling. The way they have recreated ancient Rome and even Rome before Romans came. It's such brilliant storytelling, and it's all about recreating, giving you a sense. Sometimes when I go to a place which has a lot of ruins, I kind of get lost in that place. I keep wondering, what could have happened here? What could have been here? Then I try to piece together. So there are myths, there are legends, there is historians and their views. There is of course the historic information. And I try to bring all of it together. And I definitely say that this is a myth or a legend, but this is the historian's perspective to it. So stories, history is like a treasure house of stories, because even the most authentic story has a different side to it. So you can actually bring in an entire experience. You can actually create very, very fascinating stories with historical destinations. How Preetham asks me, how do we get our content to the brands? Any popular blogging site or any platforms? I don't know. I don't understand saying, what do you mean by how do you get your content? You can't take content to a brand. You obviously have to focus on being visible on social media, being visible on building your personal brand out here. In such cases, the more active you're on your blogging platform, the more active your posts rank on Google, the more you are visible on social media, the more people read about you, the more you interact in events. So it's you have to build your brand first and then reach your content out to the brands. Social media, in my opinion, is the best way to kind of get visibility, and one has to just be. So, okay. Okay, in these questions, what are the major points? I'm coming to it in the next part of it. Yashwant, what is content writing? I think I think I'll have to do a completely different workshop on that. But it simply means that you're writing about your brand or about the play. In this case, it could be a destination you visit. It could be an experience that you went to and you're actually telling stories using that experience. To just put it in a nutshell.
Okay.
Yeah. And Janvi asked me, do the brands approach you, or can you reach out to them for collaboration? Well, it works both ways. In most cases, the brands approach us because the brands want to kind of tie in with us. They see a synergy between the way we tell stories and the way they want to bring in their stories into us. Again, this is a great concept for a workshop by itself, because I can tell you a lot of instances of how very important it is to blend your style of storytelling to the brand style of storytelling. Because if, for example, an adventure brand wants to talk to me, it may not make synergy at all, because I'm not too much into adventure. I'm more a culture traveler. Same if somebody is talking about recipes, for instance, because I don't cook and make recipes. So if somebody wants to ask me to do recipes, it's not something that interests me. But if I have to write a food story through my travel, then that is something that will be relevant to me. So it's about trying to synergize your brand and your interest and your audience to that of the brand. I hope I answered that correctly, but like I said, that needs a larger scope. So yeah, I don't know whether I've answered all the questions or if something is missing. But I'm going to just quickly run through the second part of the presentation, because the talk, because there's a little more to cover here, and if there are more questions, we can take them again towards the end. So we were talking about I was telling you about content, which is about how about how brands use stories in their communication and in their campaigns. But I've also said a lot of us need stories in our day-to-day communication, and mostly with reference to travel writing and blogging. How do we look for stories? So the first thing is you have to understand that everything is a story. I mean, there are stories everywhere. There is layers and layers and layers and layers of story. If you are traveling to a particular place, the walls tell a story. You go, you eat the food tells a story. You're visiting a monument, the monument has its own story. So everything has a story today. And that is why when you're looking at a destination or at an experience, you have to go with a mindset of finding these stories. Some stories are available to you. Some guide would tell you a narrative, or you'd read about it in a guidebook. But there are many stories that are not. So the first thing I would do is to look for these. Like I look for traditions. Since I am interested in culture, I look at history, I look at culture, I look at traditions, I look at little things that gives me a story. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Fushimi Inari shrine in Kyoto in Japan. It's a very iconic shrine. It's a Shinto shrine, and every tourist book talks about it. It's like one of the top 3 places, and you have to visit it. But nobody tells you who Inari is, and nobody tells you the story of Inari. And Fushimi Inari shrine is actually a Shinto shrine, and they have belong to the spirits, which is the Kani spirit. So if you go in detail and read my Insta story of the day, I have written about who Kani are. Kani is like a spirit, and Inari is one of the spirits, and she is he or she, and in fact, it's a very interesting thing. Inari can be a male and a female or both. And Inari represents rice, and Inari represents agriculture, but Inari also represents, industry, and a lot of merchants look up to Inari for blessings. And the Inari uses kitsune or foxes as their messenger. So I was very curious when I went to the Inari shrine, and I saw sculptures of foxes everywhere. And I saw Japanese wearing masks of foxes, and they were going into the shrine. And I said, what is the story? So the question, unless you ask or you read, you're not going to get that story. And then I learned that kitsune are the messengers of foxes, are the messengers of Inari. And that's very curious, right? And they are tricksters. So not all these, by the way, not all these deities and these spirits are good. A lot of them have their own hidden agendas, and they're all tricksters, and they can be, and they can change whichever way you want. And they can also be shapeshifters. So there are stories of how, funny stories I heard about how a Kinari can transform into a beautiful woman and seduce a man, or it can even take the look of an old man. And many times I've seen Inari looking like people going into a shrine, and then they shapeshift into foxes. I mean, it looks straight out of some one of those Vampire Diaries kind of books, right? So these are little trivia that I find very fascinating, and it's an interesting hook when you're talking about a destination, because otherwise you're just going to put a bit of a facts about it, and that's it. So for me, I look for stories which are like these, which are little nooks, which are little details. The other very, very fascinating story, and a fascinating place to look for stories, is food. I mean, and everybody loves food here, and every place has a special food to, it's either a drink or a food. But have you ever thought about the story, the backstories behind this food? Each place, even your recipe, your great grandmother's recipe will have a story. I found a very interesting story in the streets of Mysore. So I found this very little shop there, and it was crowded all the time. And I wondered why it was so crowded. And then I was told that this man's ancestor was the one who actually created Mysore Pak. I'm sure most of you have eaten Mysore Pak or seen Mysore Pak. And apparently the story goes that the Maharaja of Mysore asked him to come up with a unique sweet overnight, and he came up with a recipe of the Mysore Pak, and it became legendary after that. Another very fascinating story, this whole Rasgulla fight between Calcutta and Odisha, who owns it. But actually, there's a lot of backstories about how the Orient Rasgulla has, a lot of connect to the Puri temple. So each place, I went to a very small little, it's called the smallest village in the world. It's smallest town in the world. Sorry, it's called Hum, H-U-M, and it's in Croatia and Istria. It's got just 29 people, and they have a very unique brandy, which is very, very special only to that region. And this brandy, I've written about this again on my Instagram. So these are the stories that you need to look for. In Spain, we went to a very old monastery, and the nuns there are used to making these legendary sweets. Now, the interesting thing is that you can't see these nuns. You're not allowed to see them. So you're like the way I am talking to an empty screen here. You actually talk to an empty wall with a little. There's just a voice recorder, and you just press the mic and you say, "I want this sweet," and you put in the money, and the sweet box comes to you. You don't see the face, you don't see the person, and the sweet has its own story behind it. So each place, and Germany, for instance, has a lovely Christmas cake called Stollen, and during Christmas season, it is like a craze out there, and they have this whole legend that the way the Stollen is prepared, it looks like a baby Jesus in baby clothes. So every story, every food has its own interesting story. Coming back to Japan, I saw a sweet which has the faces of all the lucky gods out there. So if you actually go into the backstory of food, I'm telling you, you will never die out of stories. I mean, more than each dish has its own history. I even went to a place, I think, which is called the Melba House in Australia, where apparently the peach Melba, the ice cream, was created for the first time. So there's a lot of stories, a lot of backstories, a lot of trivia, and this is how you need to look for them. Then again, people make places. We've spoken about this at length. I told you about the story of a man who said he has seen God in Valparai. So there's this man, he's alive even today, and he says that he has seen God, and he describes how God was visible. He's very clear-headed, huh? He knows that he's sought after, a very quirky fellow, and it's very funny talking to him. In Pushkar, I met a Baba who he calls himself Alu Baba, and devotees only give him potatoes, and people go and feed him, and he apparently eats only potatoes in different forms. So when you're talking about people, you don't necessarily only have to look for the very serious and big achievers. Yeah, they make great stories, but there are a lot of these quirky guys who are also fun, and they kind of give you a lot of things to write about. Sometimes you may not find an interesting person to write about, but you may find a lot of interesting voices who tell you stories. Somebody will give you an interesting insight into a village, or somebody. I've met a man in Jaisalmer, for instance, who told me about how he was possessed by a ghost and what happened to him. I met another taxi driver who told me a lot of interesting stories of chudels and so many other haunted stories. The person who accompanied me to Bangad told me about how he and his family and his friends were all haunted, how they jumped on the wall and they went late evening after 6 o'clock, and how a lot of them got possessed and some of them got hysterical and what all happened. So people make places, and it's so important to listen to their stories. It's so important because everybody is dying to tell a story. I'm sure all of you here, if I ask 76 of you to tell me one story, each of you will tell me 100 stories of your experiences. So document them. Write those stories. No story is good or bad. A story is a story. And that is what makes it very special. So then, of course, you can write about adventure, sports, nature, birding stories. I remember I went looking for a Sri Lankan frogmouth in the middle of the night in a small little dam which was built by demons, supposedly by legends in Kerala. So when you start looking for one story, you'll find another story. It's a layer. Then something else will tell you another story, and then that becomes like it just becomes like a journal, like a whole garland of stories stitched together. All you have to do is to keep your minds tuned into stories. Hidden and offbeat places, and this is something which I find extremely fascinating. Most of the time, we look for the exotic places, we look for something very special, but we don't realize that there's a lot of offbeat and there's a lot of unusual story right in our own backyards. I remember going to this little village near Hassan in Karnataka, and there was a huge water. It was just basically this village has no civilization, no human people, nothing there, and all that was there was just water everywhere. And there was a ruins of a church which was floating in it, and there was nothing else that could be seen, only the spire. and there was nothing. There's no huts, there's no people. It's a village that doesn't exist on the map, apparently. So I went and then did a little bit of research, found out that the village is called Shettihalli. Today it's become almost like a tourist destination, but I'm talking about 10, 15, or 10, 12 years ago. And I realized that the village was have been people from villages have been rehabilitated from there because of a flooding that was caused by a river after a dam that was built there. And this church itself belonged to the 18th century, and it was built by a French. So just see the number of layers of story, that once you start stumbling upon one offbeat hidden place in your own backyard, you suddenly realize that there are so many things that just comes out. And I went and met, I went to the local church there and asked them for stories. I went and met some local people nearby and asked them for stories. And everybody had, and then of course I researched a bit on and through the newspapers and historical documents. And then I put together the whole story about the place, which itself had multiple layers of story. So offbeat travel gives you an offbeat destinations, give you a lot of stories, and it's something that which you all have to keep your eyes and ears open for. So just going to end this here now. Quick recap on just 4 or 5 very important points when you're writing a story. Yes, a story is personal, and a story has to be experiential, and the story is unique and it's about you. But it's also not always about you, especially, and I'm saying this as a very paradoxical statement, because when you're looking at Instagram today, everybody's saying I. Shift the focus of attention from you to the place. Shift the focus of attention to the experience. Shift the focus of attention to the person sitting opposite to you. Shift the focus of attention to the waiter who's around you, to the taxi driver, to the chai wala. Tell the story through their eyes. Yes, it's your story, but at the end of the day, they are the heroes and heroines of your story. So try and look at the story from a different perspective when you're writing, looking for stories. Write in your own unique style, your own unique voice. Every conversation can become a story, but at the end of the day, it is your voice that is very important out there. Again, like I said, everything tells a story, from street corners to ruins to. I met this puppeteer in a small little village in Sindhudurg, and he had a little puppet museum there in his village. And when I was talking to him, he told me about how his ancestors were spies during the Maratha industry, because these were puppeteers who used to go from village to village, and they used to do all the puppet shows. And he was telling me how puppets themselves are oral traditions, right? And the men who were puppeteers used to be spies. And I thought that was very fascinating. I immediately started imagining what would be like at that time and about that village. So look for stories everywhere. You will be surprised at the amount of stories that you get. We've spoken about this before. People make places, and I think that's very important. This is another very important point I have not mentioned before. Show more and tell less. I know in the days of Instagram and videos, we are obviously showing a lot more through the images and videos, but your words can also be, can also do the role of a photo or a video. When you're saying that it was a hot day, tell the viewer how hot it is. Describe the place. Explain the heat, because then you will be able to understand the place better. So when you're writing your descriptions and when you're writing your experience, try and show more of the place in your stories. And that's very important as well, because that's why I keep saying show more, tell less. So yeah, so we've almost come to the end of our talk, and I would just like to end with one story. But before that, I want to say that storytelling connects, storytelling resonates, and most important, storytelling sells. I'd like to tell you one last story. It's a personal story, and it's a story from Ladakh. And all of us have been to Ladakh, and I'm sure most of us have been to Ladakh, I'm assuming. And Ladakh has so many stories. I mean, like every place is a story, right? I mean, and you can talk about fascinating destinations I mean, there's so much out there. But my story goes back to what I believe in, that is people make places. And I want to tell you the story of my taxi driver called Dorji. And so we were returning after a 10-day trip from Ladakh, and Dorji and I were like, I've written about this, and you can read in detail on my blog. Dorji and I were like, okay, we were not the best of friends. He was a little reserved, but he was friendly, and he was a nice guy. He used to listen to all 80s music. He had weird taste. He came from and he would not talk much. He was very moody, like most taxi drivers are. You would hate to ask. I can't ask him more than 3 questions at a time. But it was fun being with him. So when we were coming back at Tanglangla, we were crossing Tanglangla, and that time it started snowing, and this was the first time I've seen snow in Ladakh. So I got all excited and I started taking photos. And Dorji was very angry, and he was like, "Get into the car now." So I was like, okay, I didn't want to anger him. It's after all the last day of my trip, and I just got into the car, and I was just me and my husband, and we were traveling. And then we were like quiet, and within a few minutes, we realized that when we were crossing the mountains, there's suddenly a snowstorm came. The snow that we saw just became a massive snowstorm. And Dorji was like very panicking. Like, for someone who's always reserved, I found like a little panic on his face. And within minutes, we were like right on top of the mountains, no civilization around us. It's like, you can imagine if you've seen the Ladakh roads, it's very treacherous. We were at a high drop. There's just like at 15,000 feet we were at, and we could just fall off this way. And we were right on top, and there's nothing we could see. And the next thing we realized is in the snowstorm is we could see a truck right in front of us. And the truck was the first to have got caught in the snowstorm. Its tires and wheels and everything was like literally dug in snow. And within seconds, there were like rows of vehicles behind us, and there was rows of vehicles, and we were like in the middle of the mountains, and we could not go anywhere. And then everybody became silent. People said there's no way you could, now even the army can't come, there's nothing that's going to happen. We were all anxious, we were scared. People said there have been days that you could get stranded in the mountains. I heard horror stories of how people have thrown trucks from the mountains downhill, and so that you could pass. Various stories that we would hear, and it took hours. It almost took 2, 3, 4, and there's nothing you could do. You're just literally locked up. And the snowstorm didn't show any sign of reducing. Then at some point, suddenly, Dorji got so angry, he just got out of the car, and with his bare hands, believe me, he was just wearing a thin jacket and just regular shoes. With his bare hands, even before he could say anything, he just started just pulling the snow out of his hand, just pulling and pulling and pulling whatever snow he got. He started picking it, and he just started throwing. And suddenly everybody started seeing him, and what started with one guy doing it became a movement. It was almost like everybody out there. Obviously it's a very futile thing to do because it's snowing continuously, but he was literally just like picking and everything and throwing it out. And maybe the nature gods heard us or saw him, and the snowstorm suddenly stopped. And after hours and he continued, he didn't care. He just continued cleaning it out of his own hands. And then there were people chipping in. There were cops, there were some police, there were some army guys, there were tourists, there were some foreigners, there were truck drivers, there were all of us, whatever little we could do, we all started in that little narrow mountain road, pulling out whatever snow we could. And believe me, to me, that one incident, it is like it's not just a memory, it kind of symbolizes the entire Ladakh resilience to me. The entire Ladakh experience can be summed up in that one story, because it's a story of their people. It's a story of the resilience. It's a story of the way they are as amazing humans. And when I told him, thank you and all that, he's like, kuch bhi nahi hai. He's like, he was very nonchalant about it. Big deal, we fought in Kargil and all, this is nothing. It's the day-to-day thing for them, snowstorm and getting stranded and all of that. But honestly, I used to come back and I used to think and say, what amazing lives we all have, and we are not really grateful for it. We see so many things in us, so many experiences we have, and it's so important as travel writers and bloggers and content creators or content marketers or whatever we are or whatever we're going to be. It's so important that this is what storytelling can do. It can tell you stories of civilizations. It can tell you stories of people. It can tell you stories of cultures. It can tell you stories that goes deep into your past. And it's so powerful. And anything that you write today is a story. So thank you so much. I hope you liked this little session on storytelling and writing and blogging. If there's anything that I need to, any more questions left, I'd like to answer them. And if there's any pointers I have missed, I'm sorry. I don't know if this is what you were expecting from this session, but I do hope it kind of was interesting.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you so much. It was such an interesting and intriguing session, and there are so many takeaways for me, for all the students. And you've actually made us realize that whole life is a story, every day is a story, every surrounding is a story. We just need to realize that. And of course, tourism destinations. I would say Taj Mahal is not famous for the building; it is more famous for the story that goes behind it. So that is the biggest takeaway for us. And thank you so much. It was a lovely, lovely session. And I hope to invite you again for another session because there were a lot of questions on how to do the content writing
Yeah.
and where to put it up. So I think that should be a separate session altogether. So
Yes.
we'll be in touch with you so that regarding content writing and how to promote your content, we can have a separate
Yeah,
session on
I could do an
altogether.
entire technical workshopy kind of a workshop kind of
Yeah,
session only on writing and tips and things. It would help to kind of probably have a set of
sure.
questions before so that I could draft my workshop around it as well.
Sure, sure, sure. And you've got so many fan following among our students. So many of them are actually writing that we follow you on the Instagram. And today evening, I'm
Thank
also
you so much.
starting to be on Instagram and start following you for the stories.
Thank you. Thank
So
you.
thank you.